Welcome to the Crunch McDabbles Show. I'm your host, Crunch McDabbles, the greatest host of all time. Interesting. So this is the only show where we take a deep dive into the Pathfinder Second Edition rules and bring you every little detail we find. Today's show, Snagging Strike. Okay, so we flip through the core rule book and we go to the fighter section and we're checking out fighter feats, and then there it is, a first level fighter feat called Snagging Strike. So let's check it out to see what it is, what it does, and whether it's any good or whatever else we can find. So first of all, we should mention that Snagging Strike is only available to fighters or those that take the fighter archetype. It's not a cross-class feat shared with barbarians or rangers or any other class, and it doesn't show up, at this time anyway, with any of the archetypes besides fighter, in the way that, say, power attack shows up for the Mauler archetype. So at this point, the only way to get Snagging Strike is to be a fighter, or to take the fighter dedication feat, and then select Snagging Strike as a feat. With that being said, we see that Snagging Strike is one action to use, and we see that it has no traits associated with it other than fighter. And this is good because usually those traits like open or flourish, they impose restrictions on when you can use the feat or how often you can use it. So Snagging Strike has no such limitations. Use it whenever you want, as long as you have an action to use it. But while there are no trait restrictions on using this feat, there is one requirement that is quite restrictive. It says you have one hand free and your target is within reach of that hand. So this is actually a pretty big restriction because it requires that you fight with a one-handed weapon and nothing in your other hand. Therefore, it prohibits all other fighting styles except single weapon fighting. You can't be two-weapon fighting and get the damage benefit of double slice. You can't be two-handed fighting and get the benefit of a nice D10 or D12 weapon. And you can't be sword and board fighting and get the defensive benefit of a shield. So you're giving up damage and defense. All for what? What do you get with this feat? Okay, so let's break down the description. It says you combine an attack with quick grappling moves to throw an enemy off balance as long as it stays within your reach. Grappling as defined implies something used at close range to gain an advantage, either by imposing a position or inflicting damage. So this isn't gripping or holding an opponent, it's dealing damage and imposing a position to gain an advantage. So in game terms, the attack works like this. You declare you are making a snagging strike, and of course you meet the requirement of having one hand free, and then you make a melee strike against a target's armor class. If the strike hits, not only do you deal damage, but the target is flat-footed until the start of your next turn, or until it's no longer within reach of your hand, whichever comes first. So keep in mind the target could, on its turn, just move away from you without making any kind of check, no athletics check to break free, or no flat check to see if it can do an action. It simply moves, and in doing so, removes the flat-footed condition. Keep in mind, too, that this flat-footed condition lasts up until the start of your next turn, so the entire party, every single member, also benefits from this condition, again assuming that the monster doesn't move out of your reach on its turn. Either way, this is basically a 2-for-1. You're making an attack that if it hits, you deal damage and impose a condition on the target. So that is the trade-off. You're trading damage and defense for an ability to do damage, albeit a smaller amount, and impose the flat-footed condition on the target. How much extra damage does making a target flat-footed amount to? Let's get into the nuts and bolts of this thing to see how it stacks up. It's actually a pretty interesting math situation. Okay, let's get into some math here. Let's say we're using a longsword to attack a monster with an armor class of 18. We're first level with an 18 strength, giving us a +9 to hit. So if we make our attack straight out, our average damage on the first attack is 6. On the second attack, it's 3.4, and on the third attack, it's 1.3, giving us a total of 10.7 average damage for 3 attacks. So there is our baseline. That's the number we're trying to beat. If we use a Snagging Strike on the first attack, the average damage is going to be the same because it's the same armor class. So the average damage is 6. But if we hit on the first attack, then the second attack is made against a flat-footed armor class, now an armor class of 16 instead of 18. Then our damage on the second strike against an armor class of 16 would be 4.3 instead of 3.4. So that's a little better. However, we don't get that damage all the time. Only when we hit with the Snagging Strike on that previous attack, on that first attack. So we look back at that first attack and we see that we're hitting that armor class of 18 60% of the time, and we're missing 40% of the time. This means that we get 60% of the 4.3 and 40% of the 3.4. And so when we multiply those two out and then add them together, we get 3.94. So not as much as the 4.3, but still more than the 3.4. Then on the third attack, this gets even more complicated. On the third attack, we have 2 different damages again. So we have a damage if we were hitting an armor class of 18, and then we have a damage if we're hitting an armor class of 16. But this time we have had 2 chances to hit the target, that being 60% on the first attack, and if we missed, 35% on the second attack, meaning the chance to miss both times is 0.4 times 0.65, giving us only a low 0.26% chance that we would have missed on both attacks. This means that we take 0.26 of the low number against armor class 18, and we take 0.74 of the higher number against the armor class of 16, for a total of 1.892, which is better than the 1.3. It brings the total average for the round when using Snagging Strike from 10.7, remember that's our baseline, up to 11.832. Now that's pretty good. That's over one more average damage. Now it's still not as good as a two-handed sword, which would give you around 13 average damage, but it's still a little better, and there's more to consider here. But wait, there's more. This feat isn't just adding damage for you, it's adding damage from every other party member that attacks this target now, because they are attacking a lower armor class. And they could potentially use all 3 of their attacks against this flat-footed armor class. Even better, rogues could get their sneak attack damage without having to make that tricky rogue's gambit where the rogue, that squishy party member in leather armor, has to move away from the safety of the party, way over to the far side of the monster to get into a flank to get their sneak attacks off, all of which sets the stage for disaster as the rogue is exposed to who knows what can happen. So yeah, all of your party attacks now are against a decreased armor class, plus getting the rogue sneak attack damage. So there's no way to quantify this definitively because every party and situation is different, but let's just say this could be quite a bit of added damage. One last thing to note here on Snagging Strike. It's one action to use, and there's no limitations to how much you can use it. So if you miss, just use it again. Maybe even try a third time. Also, you could potentially make 3 Snagging Strikes against 3 different targets, making them all flat-footed. This could even be 4 targets if you're quickened from the haste spell. So this potentially could turn your party fighter into a giant debuffer whose main function is just to make monsters easier to hit for everyone else. It's a pretty interesting role for a fighter. And one last thing here. There's no size requirement like there is when making other types of athletic attacks like grapple. Usually you would be limited to things that are no more than one size category larger than you. But this feat lists no such restriction. Basically, you're just distracting your target enough with your free hand to make them flat-footed, even if that hand really had no chance to actually do anything to them. So to summarize the good and the bad here, the bad, you have to single weapon fight. That's limiting. It's not as much damage. You're going to be limited in weapon choices that aren't the highest damage, and you don't have the defensive option of a shield. Finally, it's pretty easy for a monster to break the flat-footed condition. They just have to move away from you. Now, at a minimum, that uses up their action if they want to do that, or one of their actions, and it could potentially incur an attack of opportunity. So maybe that actually belongs on the good list. And for the good is pretty good. You make an attack that if it hits, deals damage and debuffs the target, all for one action. And the target is debuffed for the whole party. So what this feat gives you, what makes it so great, it's a feat that is effective and that you can use often, and it gives the fighter a chance to take on a different sort of role in your party, that of a debuffer. So this could be kind of fun. It'd be a fun, different sort of role for a fighter. Well, that's it. I've been your host, Crunch McDowell's. Our mission is, and has always been, to give you some real knowledge so you can survive out there in a dangerous fantasy world.